In 1877, one man controlled more private wealth than the United States Treasury. By the time his great-great-grandchildren were adults, most of them were working ordinary jobs. Some had trouble paying rent. This isn't a story about bad luck. It isn't a story about a stock market crash, or a war, or a scandal that emptied the vault overnight. It's a story about what happens when a family builds a fortune and never builds the architecture to hold it. This is the Vanderbilt fall, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it happened. Because the mechanism isn't hidden. It was just never taught. If you want to understand how fortunes are actually built and actually lost, subscribe now. We break down the real architecture behind generational wealth every week, and this is one of the most important case studies in American financial history. The Commodore. How one man built an empire. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a farmer and ferryman. He had almost no formal education. What he had instead was an instinct for a very specific kind of advantage, controlling infrastructure other people depended on. He started with a single boat, ferrying passengers and freight around New York Harbor. By his 20s, he had built a small fleet. What made him dangerous wasn't the boats. It was his willingness to undercut every competitor's price until they went bankrupt, then raise prices once he owned the route outright. Rivals paid him to stop competing. This wasn't an occasional tactic. It was the entire operating model, repeated for 60 years across two industries. By the 1850s, the Commodore, a nickname he earned and kept for life, controlled a shipping empire that stretched from coastal steamers to transatlantic lines, including routes serving the California gold rush traffic through Nicaragua, cutting weeks off the journey compared to competitors. Then, in his 60s, when most men of his era were retiring, Vanderbilt did something almost no wealthy person does. He abandoned an industry he already dominated and started over in a new one. He sold down his shipping interests and moved into railroads, first the New York and Harlem Railroad, then the New York Central, consolidating competing lines into unified systems with standardized track gauges, shared terminals, and predictable schedules. This is a detail worth sitting with. Vanderbilt didn't just buy railroads, he industrialized the idea of a railroad, turning a patchwork of regional lines into the first version of a modern transportation network. By the time he died in 1877, Vanderbilt's estate was valued at somewhere between $100 and $105 million, at a moment when the entire U.S. federal budget was around $240 million a year. Contemporary estimates placed his fortune at roughly $1 out of every $87 in circulation in the entire American economy. There is no clean modern equivalent for a concentration of wealth like that, which is exactly why the $200 billion figure you'll see cited is a share of economy estimate, not a currency conversion. We'll flag that again later, but it matters now. This was not simply a rich man. This was a man who was, in a literal sense, a meaningful fraction of the entire American financial system. Here's the part that gets lost in most retellings, though, and it's the detail that actually explains everything that comes after. The Commodore built an empire, but he built almost no institution around it. There was no family constitution, no family office, no trust structure designed to survive his death. There was, essentially, one aging man, one dominant business mind, and a will. Before we get into what happened next, I want to know what you think. Drop a comment. Do you think concentrated genius like the Commodore's is something that can actually be passed down? Or does it always die with the person who built it? I read every comment on these videos, and some of the best discussion happens right here. The one heir who got it right. Cornelius Vanderbilt had 13 children. When he died, he did something almost unheard of for the era. He left roughly 95% of his fortune to a single son, William Henry Vanderbilt, deliberately bypassing more equal distribution among his other children. This decision is worth pausing on because it's the single most important governance choice in the entire Vanderbilt story. And it's the one generation where the family actually did something structurally sound. The Commodore believed correctly that dividing a fortune this size among 13 heirs would fragment not just the money, but the control. The railroad empire needed one hand on the wheel, not 13. So he consolidated. William Henry, previously dismissed by his father as unambitious, he'd been sent to run a Staten Island farm as a young man, seen as the family's disappointment, inherited almost everything, along with the seat as president of the New York Central. What happened next surprised almost everyone who'd written William Henry off. In under 9 years, he didn't just preserve his father's fortune, he nearly doubled it, growing the estate to roughly $200 million by his own death in 1885. He did this the boring way, consolidating rail holdings further, investing conservatively, avoiding the kind of speculative ventures that ruined other Gilded Age fortunes. William Henry is, in a very real sense, the high watermark of Vanderbilt wealth, both in raw dollar terms and in stewardship discipline. He understood something his descendants would forget, that preserving a fortune requires the same seriousness as building one, just pointed in a different direction. But here's the structural crack that opens right at this moment of peak success, and it's the hinge the entire rest of this story turns on. William Henry did not repeat his father's consolidation strategy. He divided his $200 million fortune roughly equally among his 8 children. On paper, this looks fairer. In practice, it was the beginning of the end. 2 consolidations built the empire. The very next generation began splitting it, and once a split like that starts, there is no version of history where it reverses itself. The Gilded Age spending war. The third generation of Vanderbilts didn't lose the fortune through bad investments. They lost it, or rather began losing it, through architecture. Specifically through a competitive building war that had almost nothing to do with shelter, and almost everything to do with status signaling among a very small, very wealthy, very socially anxious circle of families. To understand this generation, you have to understand the social battlefield they were fighting on. In the 1870s, New York's older aristocracy, families whose money came from land and early trade, not industrial fortune, did not consider the Vanderbilts real society. The gatekeeper of that world was a woman named Mrs. Astor, whose ballroom famously fit exactly 400 guests, and whose approval was the only currency that mattered socially, regardless of how much money you had. The Vanderbilts responded the way people with enormous new capital and no social standing often do. They built their way into acceptance. William Henry's daughter-in-law commissioned a fancy dress ball in 1883, so lavish and so widely covered by the press that Mrs. Astor herself was reportedly forced to finally acknowledge the family. It worked, but it set a precedent. Status for this family would now be purchased through visible, competitive spending, and once that becomes the family's operating logic, it doesn't stay contained to one ball. Over the following 3 decades, various branches of the family built a staggering string of private residences, each designed in part to outdo the last. A chain of mansions along Fifth Avenue's Vanderbilt Row, several occupying entire city blocks. The Breakers, a 70-room Newport summer cottage, the quotation marks doing a lot of work, built in the Italian Renaissance style, with construction costs that would run into the hundreds of millions in today's terms. Marble House, another Newport estate, reportedly costing more to build than the U.S. government spent on the Statue of Liberty's pedestal in the same era. Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, at 178,000 square feet, still the largest privately owned house ever built in the United States, complete with its own dairy farm, forestry program, and village. None of these were investments in the financial sense. They were depreciating, illiquid, extraordinarily expensive to maintain assets, built specifically to be seen rather than to compound. Staffing alone for estates at this scale often required more than 50 full-time servants per house, and most branches of the family maintained multiple houses simultaneously, occupied for only a few weeks or months each year. This is the part worth sitting with as the emotional center of this section. The family was, in effect, competing against itself. Each cousin's house had to outdo the last cousin's house. There was no elder authority, no family constitution, no shared investment committee, nothing resembling what the Rockefellers would later build, making the case that maybe 5 mansions across 3 branches of the family was enough. Each household operated as its own independent unit, spending against its own slice of the inheritance, racing peers who happened to share a surname. This pattern, status spending replacing wealth building, is something we've traced across almost every collapsed dynasty we've covered on this channel, and it always follows the same shape. If you want the deep dive on the psychology behind it, we broke down exactly why old money treats boredom as a virtue in an earlier video. Link in the description, and I'll drop the card on screen now. It directly explains why this Vanderbilt spending pattern was so different from how surviving dynasties actually behaved. The mechanism: 4 structural failures. This is the section where we stop narrating the story and start doing the forensic work, because the Vanderbilt collapse isn't really about extravagance. Extravagant families have survived for centuries. What killed this fortune was a specific, repeatable set of structural failures. Let's go through them one at a time. Failure. 1. Partible inheritance without a consolidating mechanism. The Commodore consolidated. William Henry split evenly among 8 children. Each of those children split their share again among their own children. Do the math. A fortune that starts as one whole becomes 8 pieces. Then those 8 pieces fragment further into dozens, then into over 100 descendants by the 4th and 5th generations. No single branch retained enough capital, after a few generations, to exercise the kind of market-moving leverage the Commodore once had. Fragmentation isn't just about smaller numbers on paper. It's about the loss of concentrated financial power itself. Failure 2. No family office, no unified investment vehicle. Compare this to what the Rockefeller family built in the same era: a centralized family office, formalized in the early 20th century, that managed investments, philanthropy, and governance under one professional structure, regardless of how many descendants there eventually were. The Vanderbilts built nothing equivalent. Each branch handled its own finances independently, hired its own advisors, made its own decisions, and critically, competed with the other branches instead of coordinating with them. There was no shared vehicle compounding on behalf of the whole family. There were dozens of separate, shrinking pools of capital, each spent down independently. Failure 3. The businesses were sold off, not preserved. The core asset, the railroad empire itself, was gradually sold down across the generations, partly to fund the mansion building, partly because later generations had less involvement in actually operating the businesses their fortune came from. This is a critical distinction that shows up across every dynasty we've studied. Fortunes that survive tend to stay invested in operating assets that keep generating income. Fortunes that convert into cash, real estate for personal use, and consumables tend to enter a one-way spending spiral because a mansion doesn't pay you back. Failure 4. Timing. The fortune matured directly into the income tax era. The federal income tax became permanent in 1913 with the ratification of the 16th Amendment, followed by the introduction of a federal estate tax in 1916. Earlier generations of Vanderbilt wealth had operated in a near tax-free environment. Every generation after the 1910s was transferring wealth and generating income from that wealth under an entirely different fiscal regime, one with no time to plan around, because the structures that could have mitigated it, like generation-skipping trusts and dynasty trusts, either didn't exist yet in mature form or were never adopted by this particular family. Compare this to families who built irrevocable trust structures decades ahead of legislative change. This is a timing and preparedness gap, not just a tax rate difference. Put these 4 failures together, and you don't need a market crash, a scandal, or a war to explain the Vanderbilt fall. You need 3 generations of a fortune fragmenting, uninvested in operating assets, spent competitively, and taxed under an increasingly unfavorable regime, with no institutional structure counteracting any of it. If this is the first time you're seeing all 4 of these failures laid out together, it's worth rewatching this section once, because we're about to show you the family that did the exact opposite of all 4, at the exact same moment in history, and kept its fortune intact for over 150 years. Stick around, because the contrast is the whole point of this video. The counterexample. What the Rockefellers did differently. John D. Rockefeller built his fortune at almost exactly the same time as the Vanderbilts. Standard Oil's rise overlaps directly with the Vanderbilt rail consolidation. By some estimates, Rockefeller's fortune at its peak, adjusted for share of GDP, actually exceeded the Commodore's. And yet 5 generations later, the Rockefeller family remains a functioning, wealthy dynasty with an intact institutional identity. The difference isn't luck, and it isn't that the Rockefellers were somehow more disciplined people by nature. It's that the family, starting with John D. Rockefeller Jr., built the exact institutional architecture the Vanderbilts never did. A centralized family office was formalized to manage investments across all descendants under one professional structure, rather than each branch operating independently. Trust structures were established that kept the principle of the fortune intact across generations, distributing income to heirs while preserving and reinvesting the core capital, a structural firewall against the kind of generational spend-down that hit the Vanderbilts. Philanthropy was formalized into permanent institutions, foundations, funds, that gave later generations a shared, coordinated project and identity beyond simply spending, redirecting the family's competitive energy towards something durable instead of toward each other. This is the pattern we've traced across every surviving old money dynasty on this channel. Whether it's the Rothschilds' interlocking European branches, the Wallenberg family's foundation-based control structures, or the merchant houses of Japan and their formal family constitutions. The families that keep fortunes intact for centuries all converge on the same basic toolkit: consolidation instead of fragmentation, professional and centralized management instead of independent branches, reinvestment into productive, income-generating assets instead of purely personal consumption, and formal governance, a constitution, a family council, something written down, instead of relying on the personality of one dominant founder to hold everything together after that founder is gone. The Vanderbilts had none of these, and what's genuinely striking, looking at the historical record, is that it isn't as if no one around them was building this kind of structure. The tools existed: the concept of trusts, of family governance, of centralized offices was not some later invention unavailable to the Gilded Age elite. The Vanderbilts simply didn't build it, likely because the fortune arrived so suddenly, across just 2 generations of extraordinary business execution, that there was no cultural memory yet of what it took to keep wealth like this, only what it took to build it. The unraveling what was left. By the time the 4th and 5th generations of Vanderbilts came of age, in the early to mid-20th century, the pattern had become largely irreversible. Estates were sold. The Breakers and Marble House both eventually passed out of full family ownership, either sold or transferred to preservation organizations, no longer sustainable as private residences, for a fortune that had fragmented into dozens of separate, shrinking shares. Biltmore, similarly, transitioned toward operating as a commercial estate and tourist attraction, rather than remaining a purely private family seat, a striking inversion of its original purpose as the ultimate private status symbol. Individual family members went on to lead accomplished, sometimes extraordinary lives in fields entirely disconnected from the original fortune: the arts, fashion, journalism, philanthropy, but as individuals pursuing individual careers, not as beneficiaries of a coordinated family financial structure. This distinction matters. It isn't that later Vanderbilts were failures. Many were talented, capable people. What they lacked wasn't ability. It was the institutional scaffolding that might have let ability compound alongside inherited capital, rather than having to substitute for it. The single detail that captures the arc of this entire story most cleanly comes from 1973, when descendants of the Commodore gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University, an institution William Henry Vanderbilt himself had helped fund with a substantial gift generations earlier. According to the widely cited account from Arthur T. Vanderbilt II's family history, not one of the descendants who attended was, at that point, a millionaire. 96 years, one of the largest concentrations of private wealth in American history, reduced to a family reunion where the ancestral fortune was, for practical purposes, entirely gone. That statistic, 0 millionaires 96 years later, is the single most important number in this entire video. If it surprised you, it should, because this is the fate that quietly overtakes the overwhelming majority of large fortunes, and almost no one studies why. If you want to understand how a small number of families broke this exact pattern permanently, that's what this channel exists to document. Subscribe and hit the bell because we go deep into these mechanisms every single week. The lesson: what this actually teaches us. It's tempting to read the Vanderbilt story as a morality tale about excess, spoiled heirs, extravagant houses, a family that simply couldn't handle money. That reading is comforting because it lets you believe the Vanderbilts were uniquely flawed, and that a story like this couldn't happen to a more careful family. But The actual mechanism we've walked through today tells a more useful, less comfortable story. The Vanderbilt fortune wasn't destroyed by any single bad decision. It was dissolved gradually and almost mathematically by the absence of structure. No consolidation mechanism after the first two generations. No centralized family office. No reinvestment discipline. No formal governance, and a tax environment that shifted underneath the family with no institutional preparation to absorb it. Every one of those failures, individually, is survivable. Together, compounding across 4 generations, they were fatal to the fortune, even though, notably, they were never fatal to the family's talent, drive, or accomplishment as individuals. This is precisely why old money families that do survive treat governance, the boring, unglamorous institutional work of trusts, family offices, and constitutions, as being every bit as important as the original wealth-generating business itself. It's not a coincidence that the families who built that architecture are still wealthy today, and the families that built houses instead, generally, are not. The tools that could have saved the Vanderbilt fortune existed in the Commodore's own lifetime. They simply weren't used. That gap between what was available and what was actually built is the real subject of this video, and arguably the real subject of this entire channel. Not that wealth disappears by accident, but that it disappears by omission, one unbuilt structure at a time. The Vanderbilts built the largest private fortune America had ever seen, and lost nearly all of it within 4 generations, not through disaster, but through the absence of structure. If you want to understand the families who built that structure and kept their fortunes intact for centuries, the next video in this series is linked below. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.